After the Second World War, the fate of many European Jewish survivors of the Holocaust was bleak. Some, who had lost entire families in the concentration camps or had lost everything from the war, decided to move to Palestine to establish the State of Israel. World War II veterans of different nationalities, Jewish and Gentile, decided to take matters into their own hands. One such person was Lo Lenart, who had lost 14 relatives in concentration camps, who wanted to retaliate and help refugees by joining the Haganah, an Israeli military organization, and becoming a so-called Mahal, Mitnatve Hotlaretz, or volunteer from abroad. Welcome to another Plain Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Tony, and today I'll be covering the Avia S-199 in Israeli service. If you like what we do, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. After World War II, Czechoslovakia had a shaky democracy dominated by communists, many of whom were of Jewish descent and pro-Zionist. Czechoslovakia had found itself in possession of a large quantity of German weapons, many of which had been produced under occupation within its borders. Czechoslovakia was looking for a way to restore its economy, which had been decimated after the German occupation and the destruction caused by the war. Selling weapons was an excellent way to do this. The Czech delegation to the UN voted for a Jewish state only a few months before a communist coup turned Czechoslovakia into a Soviet satellite state. Czechoslovakia then became one of the most important partners in helping arm the Jewish people in the newly formed state of Israel. Surplus German and Czech arms from World War II were purchased by the Czechoslovakian government and shipped to Palestine. While light weapons were needed, the Israelis also needed heavy weapons, tanks, and an air force to counter neighboring Arab armies. All of this aid incurred a huge financial burden for the Czechs. Stalin allowed support to continue after the communist coup, not so much to support the Israelis, but to undermine the British Empire. But Stalin's brief policy of support for the State of Israel soon faded, and in the wake of the Tito-Stalin split, all communist parties had to put their foreign policy on par with that of the Kremlin in order to prove their loyalty. In this context, the Czechoslovakian communists put an end to arms sales to Israel. In the final phase of the Second World War, the Avia company, located in Prague, Czechoslovakia, would begin assembly of the Messerschmitt Bf-109G6, Bf-109G14 fighters, and the Bf-109G12 two-seater trainer aircraft to help meet the needs of the Luftwaffe. This production was based around components supplied by German factories. After the war's end, a large stock of remaining spare parts remained. With the remaining spare parts, production resumed, with some aircraft being assembled. But the production line suffered a shortage of engines. After the Czechs' remaining supply of Daimler-Benz DB605 engines was destroyed in a fire, the Jumo 211 was used instead. The Jumo 211 was not suitable for installation on fighters, as it was originally intended only for bombers, such as the Heinkel HE-111. It was less powerful and heavier, at 720 kilograms and 1350 horsepower versus the DB605 AM 700 kilograms and 1775 horsepower. In addition, the Junkers engine did not have provision for installation of synchronizers, so it was necessary for the Avia engineers to modify the engine components to synchronize the machine guns with the propeller and to design an all-new propeller. The first Avia S-199 fighter, C-210, took off on 25th of April 1947. After solving some mechanical problems, the series production of the aircraft began almost immediately. The Avia fighter differed from the original Messerschmitt Bf-109 only in terms of propulsion and armament. Because of the new engine, the engine cowling, propeller, and spinner were modified. The armament of the S-199 consisted of two 13mm Mauser MG-131 machine guns with 600 rounds above the engine, and either two 7.92mm machine guns in the wings or two 20mm MG-151 cannons mounted under the wings in gun pods. Because of the new engine, the Czechoslovakians' aircraft performance was inferior to the German Bf-109G10. The maximum speed of the S-199 was 590 km per hour compared to 690 km per hour of the Messerschmitt. The worst problem was a change in the center of gravity of the aircraft, which greatly complicated takeoff and landing. The S-199 had another serious defect. The machine guns placed under the engine cowling were not always accurately synchronized with the propeller, which would lead to serious accidents. A total of 450 S-199 single-seaters and 82 CS-199 two-seaters were produced for training purposes, of which 24 were later converted from single-seater fighters. The Czechoslovakians helped create the Israeli Air Force by selling the nascent Israeli state 25 Avia S-199 fighter planes in 1948. The agreed cost was $180,000 per aircraft, including armament, ammunition, spare parts, pilot training, and support equipment. This was a disproportionate price for what was, by now, a mediocre aircraft. At that time, an American surplus P-51D Mustang could be sold second-hand for only $4,000. Unfortunately, due to the embargoes imposed on Israel, it would have taken weeks or months to find other offers. Time that Israel did not have given the conflict with the neighboring Arab states. A few weeks could make the difference between destruction and survival for the new state. David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, did not hesitate and gave the order to buy the planes and send the pilots to training as quickly as possible. A contract was signed for 25 Avia S-199 at a total cost of $4.5 million. The first 10 Israeli pilots departed from Sde Dov on 6th of May 1948 and arrived at the Czechoslovakian airbase at České Budějovice on 11th of May 1948. Of the 10 pilots, 2 were US volunteers and 1 was South African. These last 3 were veteran pilots of the Second World War, having served with the US Army Air Force and Royal South African Air Force respectively. The other 7 were British or Palestinian Jews, some of which were World War II veterans, while others had only completed Royal Air Force training in Rhodesia in early 1945, failing to actively participate in World War II. When all 10 pilots made their first flights, they gave their impression of the plane. None were positive. The landing gear was narrow and made the S-199 difficult to keep straight during takeoff due to the huge torque of the propeller. The plane was unwieldy and very hard to handle. The cockpit was cramped and the canopy was hard to open. The Jewish volunteers discovered that the Czech pilots called the S-199 mezek, which means mule, and they quickly understood why. The Jewish volunteers were accustomed to spacious, agile, and fast Allied fighters, such as the Spitfire, P-51D Mustang, and P-47 Thunderbolt. The shock of flying an aircraft with completely different characteristics upset them, but the Avia was all they had, and they had to make do. After only 4 days from the beginning of the training, on 15th of May, the pilots of the Sherut Afir Air Service in Hebrew, the ancestor of the Israeli Air Force, were recalled to Israel. During training in Czechoslovakia, only 5 of the volunteers, those with World War II experience, had qualified to fly the Avia, and none had flown it more than twice. The first S-199s were disassembled and loaded, along with other equipment, onto a Douglas C-54 Skymaster named Black 5. The Israeli Air Force gave the Czechoslovakian fighter the nickname Sakin, meaning knife in Hebrew. After being reassembled, the aircraft received the Israeli Air Force's coat of arms and a number ranging from 100 to 125 for identification. After the outbreak of hostilities, the war was going badly for the state of Israel, which had been invaded by an Arab force composed of Egyptians, Syrians, and Iraqis with the support of other nations such as Jordan and Lebanon. The Egyptian army was advancing north along the Mediterranean coast, arriving less than 30 kilometers from Tel Aviv. Despite the fact that the Israeli engineers of the Givati Brigade had destroyed the bridge over the Lachish River, the Egyptians continued to amass along the south bank of the river. It would take them a few hours to repair the bridge, after which they could arrive in Tel Aviv the next day. That evening, the last phases of the assembly of the first 4 aircraft had been completed in a hangar. An attack was being organized for the following days against the Royal Egyptian Air Force Airport in El Arish, in order to take the REAF by surprise and announce the existence of the IAF in a very daring way. Due to the proximity of the Egyptians to Tel Aviv, the Israeli pilots were ordered to take off with the only 4 S-199 that had arrived from Czechoslovakia. The 4 S-199, piloted by Lou Leonard, Ezer Weizmann, Modi Alon, and Leonard Cohen, took off 1 hour before dark. Leonard, who commanded the unit, had never flown in Israel before, and he did not know where Ashdod, which was less than 15 kilometers away from the airport, was located. Anachronistically, he gestured to the other pilots the direction to go. Having clarified their heading, there was another problem, as the villages along the coast all looked similar. Fortunately, wisps of smoke were seen, and shortly afterwards a column of Egyptian trucks and light armored vehicles was spotted stretching for more than a mile south of the Ashdod Bridge. This belonged to the engineering units trying to repair the bridge for the forces that were to take Tel Aviv the next day. The pilots of the four planes attacked the column, which immediately dispersed. The Egyptians were not aware of the existence of an Israeli Air Force, lacked sufficient anti-aircraft weapons, and, in some cases, had never seen an aircraft before. The fighters swooped down on the Arabs, dropped the 270-kilogram bombs they had, and started to strafe the scattering soldiers. After a few shots, the gun jammed. In reality, the bombs and the falling machine gun strafing did little damage. However, the psychological impact on the Egyptian troops was so devastating that, the next day, the order to attack Tel Aviv was cancelled. After that, the Egyptian offensive strategy became purely defensive. During the attack, South African Leonard Eddie Cohen's Red 4 plane was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Cohen was the first loss of the Israeli Air Force. At 0530 hours on 30th of May, in order to take advantage of the surprise appearance of the Israeli Air Force, the two remaining S-199, piloted by Weizmann, Red 1, and Milt Rubenfeld, Red 3, attacked the village of Tulkarm in northern Israel, which was controlled by a Jordanian-Iraqi force. In this case as well, the real damage was insignificant, but the psychological effect was devastating. On 30th of May, the unit was officially named 101st Squadron or 1st Fighter Squadron, a name that was very impressive for a unit that had 2 fighters, only one of which was operational, and 4 pilots, one of which was wounded. On the 3rd of June 1948, 2 Douglas C-47 Dakotas transport aircraft escorted by 2 Egyptian Supermarine Spitfires arrived to bomb Tel Aviv. This practice had been ongoing for some time, and had cost the lives of hundreds of civilians in the city. The Egyptian tactic was to drop bombs out the back door of the transport. Late in the afternoon, 101st Squadron was alerted that the Egyptian bombers were again on their approach to Tel Aviv. Modi Alon took the only available S-199 and took off. Arriving in the skies over the city, he spotted the 2 C-47s with 2 Spitfires escorting them. Modi Alon first flew west over the Mediterranean, thus able to approach with the sun behind him. The enemy aircraft would have a hard time seeing him, a tactic RAF instructors in Rhodesia had taught him. Arriving behind the first C-47, Alon hit it with a long burst of cannon and machine gun fire and sent it crashing to the ground. Alon's shot also hit the second C-47, which also crashed into the Mediterranean shortly after. Alon then pushed the throttle to full power and sped away at top speed without the Spitfires being able to hit him. On the 8th of June 1948, during his first mission in an S-199, Gideon Lichtman, an American pilot who had trained for only 35 minutes on the Avia, flew the first dogfight of the war against an Egyptian Spitfire that was strafing civilians in Tel Aviv. Lichtman didn't even know which trigger to fire, so he kept pressing buttons, levers, and switches until he found the right one, and chasing one of the Spitfires, he opened fire, shooting it down. Lichtman was forced to land after running out of fuel. Exactly 1 month later, on 8th of July, Modi Alon left with 2 other Avias to attack an Egyptian reinforcement column at Bir Ashlut in the Negev desert. After a successful attack, on their way back, Alon noticed 2 Egyptian Spitfires Mark 5Cs in flight, attacked them, and managed to shoot down one of them, which was Wing Commander Said Afifi al-Janzuri. On the morning of 9th of July, Lou Leonard was ordered to attack the Egyptian airbase of El Arish with 4 fighters. After a ground incident, only 3 of the Avias took off and hit the much closer Egyptian-controlled Gaza port. Only 2 S-199 returned to base, while a third, piloted by former USAF pilot Bob Whitman, did not. The next day, there was a similar situation. A pair of S-199 attacked 2 Syrian bombers near the Sea of Galilee. Ex-RAF pilot Maury Mann shot down one of the 2 bombers, while his South African ex-RAF wingman Lionel Bloch attacked the second one, chasing it as it retreated into Syria. That was the last time Bloch was seen. He never returned to base. The next morning, Sid Cohen, a former South African medical student, member of 101st Squadron and future squadron commander, took off to search for Bloch or the remains of his plane. Sid had spent more time training in Czechoslovakia, so he realized that there was something wrong with the disappearance of 2 planes in 2 days. He acted on instinct and fired a very short burst with the fuselage-mounted machine guns. When he landed, everyone noticed that all 3 propeller blades had bullet holes in them. The synchronizers were deemed faulty. Wigman, Bloch, and some thought Leonard Cohen had all likely shot their own propellers while firing their guns. That same day, Alon and Weissman departed at 16:58 hours for a mission near Ashdod. After a successful sortie, Alon returned, and during his approach to the runway, he reported that he had a problem with the landing gear, a common problem on Avias that was never solved. One or both of the pistons that lowered the struts would not extend fully. While Alon was trying to get the gears down, observers on the ground noticed something more troubling. A trail of grey smoke was coming out of his fighter's nose. Alon was told over the radio to check the temperatures of the plane's various gauges. "They are fine," Alon replied seconds before his fighter crashed in flames next to the runway, killing him. From that moment on, the Avia S-199 were rarely used by the Israelis. Very few of them were still operational, and starting from 25th of September 1948, about 50 ex-Czech Supermarine Spitfires Mark IX were arriving in Israel, which would have been much more reliable. The S-199 fighters flew with the coat of arms of the Israeli Air Force until June 1949. The Avia S-199, although an extremely unreliable aircraft, was the first aircraft of the Israeli Air Force, the only one that at that time they could acquire due to the UN embargoes. During the 13 months of IAF service, the Israeli pilots shot down a total of 8 Arab aircraft without losing a single Avia to enemy fire. The major losses were due to mechanical problems of the aircraft, leading to the conclusion that the Avia S-199 were more dangerous for the Israeli pilots than for the Arab pilots. This concludes our look at the Avia S-199 in Israeli service. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. Also, don't forget to take a look at our extensive collection of articles on our website, plain-encyclopedia.com. Thank you.